Anyway, I'm Paul Cartledge. I'm the president of the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, and I'm going to talk to you about the Battle of Platea. What if the Greeks, and by that I mean some Greeks, had lost? And I'm going to be offering you a military-cultural approach. Today is June the 11th. It's a very special day in my personal calendar. My father would have been 113 today if he'd only made it beyond where he actually did get, which was 81. It's special in another way. This is again personal. It is in fact the 90th birthday of Sir Timothy Sainsbury, and that may or may not mean anything to many of you, but he is a client of my wife, has been for many, many years. He's a major, major philanthropist. And to me and to my wife and to many, many others, he's been a very great mentor. So today is his 90th birthday. So why did I choose this particular topic to talk to you about on this particular day? Elizabeth, are we all right for the recording? Yeah, just to say that this is being recorded. It's not being live streamed. Hybrid lectures are in principle wonderful, so you could have 50 here and 150 or 650 around the world. On the other hand, the quality of the picture for the people on Zoom or other platforms is very often less than 100%. And there is absolutely nothing like an audience that you can actually see and in a way feel in 3D. This is the second such lecture I have given in the last 3 years. The previous one was at a certain school. Now I'm going to name it, Winchester College, where our Chancellor of the Exchequer was, well, what he considers to be educated. Anyway, I pitched up. I thought it would be just like you, a relatively moderate-sized gathering. Turned out it was about 150 people, very, very interesting, and I talked about Sparta. Well, of course, I'm also going to be talking about Sparta today. Sparta is inevitable, unavoidable. So I have two main reasons for choosing this particular subject, this particular year. First is 2022 AD, or CE, is the 2500th anniversary of the battle. Now, you have to remember, there is no BC or BCE naught, no AD or CE naught. So you add together 2022 and 479, and you get 2501, but you must take away 1. So this really is the 2500th anniversary of the battle. But then you might say, okay, so what? Why this battle in particular? It was fundamentally important. It was historically decisive, both militarily and culturally, which is why I've put hyphenatedly military cultural. And yet, it has been neglected, sometimes even forgotten. Now, I wrote a book fairly recently about Thebes, ancient Greek Thebes. I'm still waiting for my honorary citizenship of Thebes. It's obviously in the post. At any rate, you know the point there. Athens, Sparta, Macedon, poor old Thebes. Well, I was able to point out, not only was it at moments incredibly interesting and exciting and important, but on the other hand, for 20 years it ceased to exist in antiquity, because it was wiped out on the orders of Alexander the Great in 335 BC. So it was not just then forgotten, but non-existent, inexistent. Now the neglect of the Battle of Plataea is being remedied. I took part in the 3-day webinar, that's the web seminar, organised from Washington DC. And it encompassed people from as far away as New Zealand. Poor fellow had to stay up till about 4 a.m. his time in order to give his talk at 6 p.m. the previous day, or whatever it was. So that's a start. I wrote a book myself in 2013, published it in 2013, in the Emblems series of the OUP New York. And I chose as my emblem one object which I will be showing you a slide of later. It's a stele from Menithi in Attiki, which is ancient Athena or Cartledge, and it contains two very, very significant texts, one of which relates specifically to this battle. And I called my book after Thermopylae, which was a bit wicked because many more people have heard of, apart from the makers of 300, of course, who didn't include the word Thermopylae in the movie. But people have heard of Thermopylae, and I'll be coming back to it later on. There is still, though, I believe, tons of space for a little more consideration of this particular battle. But before I get to the actual talk, thank you first to the Society for electing me its president. I'm in the end of my second year, coming to the end of it. I've got one more year to go. Secondly, but much, much more importantly, to Fiona Hara at the back here, who is the Executive Secretary of the Society. But for her, nothing. But for her, absolutely nothing. SPHS would function, let alone function as it normally does, brilliantly. Yes. Thank you very much. And then, thirdly, thanks to a dear friend and colleague who can't be here today, a Greek friend and colleague, Anastasia Christofilopoulou. I'm always very pleased when I manage to get out that 9 syllables, I think it is. She is a curator at the Fitzwilliam Museum. I am technically pretty much non-competent, very incompetent, techno-compromised. And so she did this slideshow. There are a couple of slips on a postcard to me afterwards, please, but I'll point them out. There are the ones that I've spotted anyway. I mean, just in the words, the spelling, in the typography, not in the content or the meaning. And then, of course, as well as the audience that may or may not choose to watch this as a recording, thank you in particular for giving up your Saturday afternoon. I really am most touched that you've come along to be here present. Thank you. Well, we live in 2022, so I can't end my beginning without a trigger warning. What do you think that might be, Katrina? It's about the gore, the blood, the extreme nastiness of this particular battle. Don't worry, I'm not going to show you any of it, but I'm going to give you a quotation from, of course, a Greek tragedy, which indicates how perceived it was then. The tragedy dates to 472, so it's 7 years or so later. But looking back, this was a particularly unpleasant battle. Therefore, not only was the outcome terribly important, but the process of getting to the outcome was particularly significant in that gory sense. Right. So we begin, in a way, at the end, because this is a Greek, in a very special sense of Greek, the people who swore an oath to resist the Persians. And there are only about 32, 33 separate communities out of maybe 700 in the Aegean basin alone, out of about 1,000 in the Greek world as a whole, who were bold enough, courageous enough to sign up, i.e. to swear in the name of, in particular, Poseidon and Zeus, that they would resist the Persian invasion that was going to come in 480, 479. And so this is the victory monument, which I'll explain why and how. It was originally in Delphi. It's now what's left of it in Istanbul, which was, of course, formerly Constantinople. A bit of a clue as to why it's where it is now. And apart from this, as a living memorial of the battle, as we'll see soon, there's nothing much left of the battlefield. in terms of monuments or diagnostic traces of, this is where that bit of the battle took place. The only other substantial contemporary extant residue of this battle is a fairly recently published, in the sense that it had been found 100 plus years ago in Oxyrhynchus, which is in the Nile Valley of Egypt. But it wasn't actually published. It's an elegy, and it was composed by the most famous praise poet of 479 BC, Simonides, or Simonides, who came from the island of Chaos, or Keatia, as it's sometimes called. And it makes absolutely clear that the key roles played in the battle were those played by the Spartans and by the overall commanding officer of the entire Hellenic army, who was a Spartan. He wasn't a king, because he was a regent for a king, and his name was Pausanias, or Pausanias, and important not to confuse him with the much, much later Pausanias, Baedeker Pausanias, who's a very interesting geographical religious pilgrim of the 2nd century AD, who gives us a continuous narrative of ancient Messenian and Laconian, i.e. Spartan history, but he's writing hundreds of years later, dependent therefore on much earlier sources. Now I say that this column is predominantly Spartan. It's Greek, all Greek, in the sense that it's in the name of the Hellenes, but it's predominantly Spartan because Platea was, as our main source, who is Herodotus, I'll be coming to him shortly, very snappily described the battle. He called it the Kalistae, that is the either fairest, finest, or most beautiful victory of those we know. And so the Spartans deserve to have, as I'll show you later, the place associated with this particular monument. So, very quick recap of what we're talking about in geographical terms, and the key region of Greece that is at issue is, of course, Boeotia, Boeotia, probably something to do with Bous, something to do with oxen, quite unusually favourable to certain kinds of pasturage as well as cereal growing. In antiquity, its most distinctive feature was a lake, Lake Copais, but this was drained in fairly modern times, so if you go there today, you have no real sense of the ancient geography, which the lake divided Boeotia into a northern section, where the most important city was Orchomenos, and a southern section, where the most important city was Thebes, and by and large, over time, Thebes won out over Orchomenos. Unlike if you go all the way back to Homer, you'll find Orchomenos is in a superior position to Thebes in the catalogue of the ships in Book 2 of the Iliad. So, that's where we have to focus our attention on. Platea, I'll show you a map of that right now. Now, my lovely Anastasia dug this out, I think online. You have to be terribly careful not to infringe copyright. So this comes from an atlas of 1825, and I don't have a pointer, but the Plataeans are down the very bottom, if you can see that, and there is Lake Copais, quite clearly signalled there, and Attiki is on the border. There's Attica written in its Latin form, and the distance from Thebes to Athens as the crow flies is something like 90 kilometers or 55 or so miles. So actually horribly close. And why am I banging on about that? Because in 479, Thebes and all the rest of Boeotia were on the Persian side. Athens, Sparta, the principal leaders of the mainland resistance, with one or two island helpers. So imagine the Persians have come all the way down. In 480 BC, I'll come on right away. and I'll come on shortly. They march their way through Thermopylae, they destroy en route a couple of Boeotian cities which were resisting, Thespiae, Platea, destroyed. And then they, of course, destroy the Acropolis and the surrounding area, the Agora area, and other places too. But how do we know there was a battle of Platea? I sometimes ask myself in dark moments, did any of this ever actually really happen? How could I prove that it really? Well, there are occasional proofs. You find a battlefield, you find a corpse with a diagnostic bit of pottery dated to just the right date, or with a particular type of helmet or a particular type of arrowhead, which fix the date. You have other indications, but we are almost entirely reliant on the accident of survival of one historian, sometimes called the father of history. That's what Cicero called him. And but for him, we would have no account of the entirety of Middle Eastern history, going back as far as the middle of the 6th century BC, let alone the specifics of the four major battles of 480 and 479, that is Thermopylae and Artemisium and Salamis and Platea, and then there's a coda, just a sort of mopping up, Mycale. So there are 5 principal battles, 4 very important, one slightly less so. Herodotus is on the left and Thucydides is on the right. They're joined at the head and they look fixedly forever in diametrically opposite directions. And I think that absolutely captures Thucydides. But for Herodotus, no Thucydides. But for Thucydides, no Thucydides. His historiography was very, very different in kind, in content, from that of Herodotus. Herodotus is what we'd call a total historian. We'd call him a cultural historian, an ethnographic historian. Thucydides has a little bit of geography, a little bit of ethnography, but he is fixedly a power historian, and not just any old power, political power. And for him, that's a thing, an affair of men. There are, I think, 50 references to members of the female sex in all of extant Thucydides. There are many hundreds of references to women collectively and individually in Herodotus. Herodotus is interested in everything, in principle, and Thucydides in one big thing. So it's like the old Archilochus paradox. And Herodotus' work is the longest extant work of prose, Greek prose from antiquity. And one wonders, yes, he might have delivered it in portions. Right, I'm going to give you today the Battle of Platea, ladies and gentlemen, or probably gentlemen. And on the other hand, he might even extend it to a whole book if someone was prepared to sit around for quite a long time. But the entirety of it, which has an architecture, somebody called Myers, John Myers, once analysed in ring composition the entirety. So A right at the beginning corresponds to A1 right at the end, and then in between you get all the corresponding layers in what the Hellenistic scholars divided up into 9 books, first of which being Clio, the muse of history. And Herodotus was, of course, called most Homeric, and so that's the wonder, the gigantic dimension. What he's interested in is preserving from loss of memory, whether total or partial, of great and wondrous deeds done not just by Greeks, but by Greeks and non-Greeks alike. And then he adds, this is from his preface, especially the reason or the explanation or the justification, ITA, why they fought each other. And of course they fought each other on and off over a very long time, especially in the first 2 decades of the 5th century BC. He personally is one of the ornaments of the 5th century Enlightenment, as it's sometimes called. a genius in his own literary terms. So I might cite him as my first, as it were, exhibit A. What if the Persians had won? Would Herodotus have had the life, the freedom, the audience with which to create what is very balanced? Don't go away with the idea that it is just like a Simonides poem for somebody who's paid him to sing his praises. No, it's balanced. The Persians aren't all bad, unlike the movie 300, where they are all bad. So we do sometimes progress, but sometimes we go backwards. Plataeans. I've showed you roughly where they're southern Boeotia, and therefore very close to the border with Attica, with Athens. And so close were they that in the late 6th century there was a contest between Thebes and Athens as to whether the Plataeans would join the Boeotian state, which called itself the Boeotians. Some of us believe it was federal, a very, very early example of a proto-federal state. Well, the Plataeans decided they wanted to have nothing to do with it. So if you like, they became traitors to the Boeotian name and cause, as Thebes saw it, die-hard enemies thereafter. Well, where do you turn if you've got the biggest power in your region as your main enemy? Well, you turn to the nearest big power that's going to be able to counteract Thebes, Athens. So, 490 BC, complicated reasons. Emperor Darius I, Achaemenid ruler of the Persian Empire, which extended as far east as Afghanistan, Pakistan, into Africa, as well as Europe, because he already had what's today Thrace and Bulgaria, northern Greece, in other words, as part of his empire, decided he was very, very angry with the Athenians because they had sent ships and men to attack one of his vice-regal capitals, Sardis, in Lydia. So we're in 499, 498 BC. 8 years later, Darius sends an expedition under a Mede, that is a northern Iranian. The Greeks were very ethnocentric. They called all Persians Medes, which is sort of like calling all Scots Welsh, or something like that, because they were related, but they were very distinct in all sorts of ways. Datis, and then actually a brother of his own called Artaphernes or Artaphernes. Now, that is the Greek transcription of his Persian name. Herodotus' Persian was, shall we say, shaky. He thought all Persian names ended in sigma, so Artaphernes. No, they typically didn't. Xerxes' name, probably something like Kshayathra. Darius' name, something like Dariush. And Greeks have, I think, never really found sh very easy to say, and so that probably explains they prefer sigma. Why not? So that's enough, I think, about Boeotia. Apart from moving on to the tomb of the Plataeans. Now, why Plataeans? When Datis and Artaphernes landed, they landed famously, of course, they had Marathon, they had cavalry as well as infantry. Oddly enough, the cavalry played no role in the battle. But my point is not any of those. It is that the Athenians had one ally, somebody who came to help them when the Persians invaded, and that was Platea. So, very famously, in the plain of Marathon is a huge mound. It's being played around with, excavated, probably bears very little relation to what it originally looked like in the 480s BC. And it's the same name as the Hungarian financier Soros. Soros means a heap, and it's a massive, great heap. Well, that is the tomb of, according to Herodotus, 192 Athenians. Not 193, not 191, but 192, as against, well, he says there was something like 6,400 round figure on the Persian side who died at Marathon. There were 1,000 Plataeans fighting. We think there were perhaps 9,000 Athenians. And of course it was an extraordinary, unprecedented and unpredicted victory. Herodotus says something like, no one or very few people in mainland Greece had ever seen a Persian enemy in a fighting before. So this is pretty terrifying in principle as well as the actuality. Two Plataeans is what this much smaller lump is called. It has been found to contain some graves, but not enough probably, not diagnostic, not in other words, definitely 490 BC. But I put it there just to remind you that the Battle of Marathon, which often is thought to be just an Athenian victory, the Athenians themselves often portrayed it so, actually was a victory of the Athenians and the Plataeans. And so it was on the soil of these men's relatives and sons and so on, 10, 11 years later, that the Battle of Platea was going to be fought. And it was where the graves, of course, of all those who fell, according to Herodotus, very few, by comparison with the Persians at Marathon or with the Persian side at Platea. But the Plataeans were very keen on their association, not surprisingly, with the Battle of Platea. And some of you may have read in Thucydides, book 3, there's a dialogue, rather unpleasant one, in front of Spartan judges between Plataean speakers and Theban speakers. Theban speakers are saying, these Plataeans, they're allies of our enemies, the Athenians. They're traitors, they should all be executed. And the Plataeans say, but remember the Battle of Platea. Look what we did. Now this is calculated to apply and to appeal to the Spartans, because for the Spartans, the Platea battle was their battle. However, it ended badly, and Platea was destroyed yet again. I've already mentioned its destruction in 480. In 426, the Thebans destroyed it yet again. And then it was to be destroyed by the Thebans again in the fourth. You know, Platea has a very checkered, shall we say, history. Now, somehow or other, Leonidas has got cut off at the knees almost. But anyway, many of you will probably have been to Thermopylae, the hot gates, so called because the springs, the sulfur springs, which are still used as bathing waters, are in the pass. You can feel them if you just stop off by the road and watch the water running down. And in the mid-50s, a bunch of Greek Americans got together to pay for this memorial. Much later, 15 years later, a memorial was added for the people of Thespiae. Now, Thespiae, like Platea, was destroyed by the Persians because it opposed the Persians. It fought on the side of the Greek resistors against the Persian invaders. So you have now two major monuments in this valley. And the Spartans, of course, have made, and modern Spartans, I mean my fellow citizens, I'm an honorary citizen of modern Sparta, terrific thing of this heroic resistance under one of the two Spartan kings. Actually, it was a defeat. I mean, a very serious defeat. The Battle of Thermopylae held the Persians up. It set an example of courage, and therefore, in a way, was absolutely crucial for cementing a very shaky alliance, which might otherwise have fallen apart as the Persians pour through Thermopylae. Their fleet pours down to the area of Athens port, and the next major confrontation is, of course, going to be the Battle of Salamis. But Thermopylae is the Spartan myth, and it's actually very often wrongly taken as a myth in the sense of false, even today. For example, I expect many people think all the 300 Spartans died at Thermopylae. Actually, they didn't. Leonidas died, 298 of the 300 died, but the other two, for different reasons, survived the Battle of Thermopylae. So that's a myth to be struck off. The other myth, which actually came to bite the Spartans later, was you Spartans never surrender. Well, actually, in the next major confrontation, Greek, the so-called Peloponnesian War, 425, a bunch of Spartans, and admittedly lesser Laconians, who weren't full Spartan citizens, they surrendered. And they were taken as hostages back to Athens. They were put in a pen in the open, and for 4 years they were there, somewhere near the Agora, where people could come up and look and jeer at them and make fun of them. And one, this is in Thucydides, one ally of the Athenians, so he says, came up and asked a Spartan, what was wrong with you in 45? Why did you surrender? We were told you never surrender. Well, the guy gave a classically laconic, that is, snappy and witty response. He said, we weren't actually fighting against real men then, because what did for us, and he used a word which means spindles, a woman's implement in weaving. So we were killed by feminine implements in a most unmasculine way. So giving up was not a sign of our lack of masculinity. We weren't fighting really against men anyway. So that's the sort of gender politics that you would get in ancient Greece in the 5th century, focusing on this constant to and fro of dialogue, dialectic, but typically hostile interchange between Athens and Sparta. Who is the best Greek? Which Greeks really saved Greece from the Persians? And that's a long-going, ongoing culture war, which I'll come back to shortly. So I just want to give you one little shot of the sort of things that were being produced in Sparta by craftsmen who probably weren't full Spartan citizens. They were very, very good at, in particular, small bronze lost wax figurines. And this is really teeny tiny. It's now in a museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And it's unusual because it has that transverse crest. There is no other example. The so-called Leonidas, which is, of course, in marble, he has a crest back to front, a mohawk, as it were. But this one is thought possibly, therefore, to represent not just any ordinary Spartan. He's wearing his typically Spartan cloak that would be dyed red from the juice of the murex mollusk, which is fished in great quantities off the Laconian coast. And it's thought possibly, therefore, that this guy is not, as I say, just any old ordinary Spartan on, as it were, night duty, but maybe a commanding king. And from the late 6th century onwards, the Spartans they had a bit of trouble with their two kings. If they disagreed, that could be really very difficult to maintain an expedition, and it actually happened. And thereafter, the Spartans passed a law. Only one king could command any one Spartan-led force. So you might have two kings in the same battlefield or at war at the same time, but they're not commanding the one same army. So I'd like you to think of him as an early version of Pausanias. And one distinctive feature, I don't know if it's coming across to you, but it's clear to me, his hair. Normal adult Greek males cut their hair and grew a beard. Alexander the Great was one of the first to abandon the beard. He was the first to shave. This was thought to be pretty shocking. Looks like a boy or a woman. Yes, but he was manly enough without this extra add-on. Spartans were peculiar in their facial hair or head hair in two ways. One, when they became adolescent and older, so late teens, let's say, they stopped cutting their hair. And I always feel a bit sorry for the presumably were slapheads among the Spartans who desperately tried to maintain the national garb, of having long hair. Well, his are coming right down over his shoulder, and there are tons of examples of that. The other peculiarity was that Spartans shaved the moustache. They grew a beard, but they shaved a moustache. And this is a source much later, but it says, when the chief officials of the state came into office every year, the ephors, they issued two proclamations. One to the Spartans: shave your moustaches and obey the laws. And those of you know the statue I'm referring to, the Leonidas as it's called, he has no moustache, classically Spartan. Second injunction was to declare that all the helots who are Greek, they're natives, they've been there forever, they worship the same gods as the Spartans, goddesses, heroes, heroines, they worship the same pantheon, and yet they're treated as if they are not unpersons because they were allowed families, but as unfree. And so whenever one reads, as one does in, for example, Aeschylus's Persians, come on Greeks, fight for your freedom. And indeed, the Spartans were right up there, fighting for the freedom of themselves from being taken captive, prisoner, or killed by a barbarian enemy. But back home, they kept in servitude, thousands upon thousands, many more times bigger than themselves, Greeks. And it's just one of those, well, puzzles is not quite the right word, because I think they are actually the key to explaining a lot of peculiarities about Sparta. But it's something one mustn't forget when you think of the Spartans going off to Thermopylae, going off to Platea. Well, at Platea, they took with them, allegedly, Herodotus, 35,000 of these helots, as opposed to 5,000 of themselves. Seems almost unbelievable. And they were armed as light armed, not heavy armed, not as heavy armed infantry and hoplites, but as soldiers generally. So, moving on. View of the Platea battlefield. And German has a wonderful word, Trümmerfeld, a field of ruins. And that's what you're looking at there, of course. And it's a reminder that by 479, the high summer, 479, August, September, the actual city of Platea was in ruins. I mean, it didn't exist physically. If you don't have a city centre where you can meet, hold meetings, and establish yourselves as a corporate body of Plataeans, then Platea doesn't exist. So that's simply to remind you of how rough the situation was. The Athenians were cityless in a different way. They had decided to abandon their city before the Persians came. Persians had then destroyed the Acropolis and below, and they did it again in the summer of 479, not long before the Battle of Boeotia. But the Athenians were, as it were, en masse as a polis, a citizen state, on the ships. So they retained a corporate entity. Sparta, long way away, deep down in the Peloponnese, with an isthmus between them and central Greece. Herodotus goes on about how the Spartans kept worrying about whether or not the wall across the isthmus would be finished in time to stop the Persians coming down into the Peloponnese. I think this is all a bit of Athenian propaganda, because actually that was never a serious starter. If the Spartans were going to seriously take on the Persians, it would have to be beyond the isthmus, not in the Peloponnese, and it would have to be en masse by land, because Sparta is a land power. I've contributed a chapter to a forthcoming Cambridge companion. It's Cambridge World History of Genocide. And a friend of mine who's actually editing it, Ben Kiernan, he's written a book in which the word genocide and Spartans appear side by side. And he's referring to the Helots. Well, I think it's a bit of a stretch. But for the Helots, no Sparta. So it wasn't really in the Spartans' interest to wipe them out. And they never actually had that project. But my chapter is actually about a number of cities which either Greeks wiped out of other Greeks, or foreigners, as in the case of Persia, or finally Alexander and Thebes. This is a recurring pattern. Greeks were not nice to each other when things got hot. So, I've mentioned already how this is a really major battle. I'm not going to go through all the figures and all the troops on various sides. But one fairly reliable estimate would say there were as many as 180,000 combatants. It was over about a couple of weeks, on and off. It was a sort of 11-day standoff, and then finally the battle happened, and all rather messy. And as I've said before, I haven't actually come across it myself until fairly recently, a passage in the Persae of Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon. And this is lines 816 and following. And they're spoken by the ghost of Darius, who's of course exceptionally disappointed that Xerxes is doing so badly in the Persian wars, because the Persians is set immediately after the Battle of Salamis, the Athenian Battle of Salamis. And Darius says, among other things, so great will be the mass of clotted gore spilled by the Dorian, that is Spartan, spear upon Platean soil. And I say 180k roughly. That makes it a bigger battle than either Waterloo or Gettysburg, just to give you two absolutely major, decisive battles of the 19th century. The Greeks, of course, were not very ancient Greeks at numbers. They used the same letters, the same word, for 10,000 murioi as for countless. So in other words, beyond 10,000 just seemed absolutely enormous. So Herodotus tells us seriously that Xerxes brought 5,200,000. We modern historians think 180, 200,000 possibly, of whom a good number fought at the Battle of Platea. Right, so we come to, as it were, the turning point of the lecture. I've brought you to the battle, which was a damn near run thing, as Wellington said of Waterloo. And if you believe Herodotus' account, it was pretty chaotic. If you read Ephorus' account, the later one, all went according to plan, but according to Herodotus, the Spartan command, that is Pausanias, was not exactly brilliant, and even one Spartan commander, which is completely against type, refused orders at one point. Some of us just think that's probably made up as a slur on the Spartans. But anyway, the battle in Herodotus is a very, very messy sort of thing. Its outcome, however, is absolutely clear. There was never again to be a Persian invasion of Greece by land. They didn't contemplate it. There was some thought or some feeling in the Peloponnesian War that a fleet which was funded by the Persians conceivably might be Persian in some sense, attacking mainland Greece, but actually never eventuated. And so in the sense that what we call Greek, Hellenic, culture, society, politics, were free from the major threat and the instantiated threat of 499 to 479, after 479. Indeed, to such an extent that an alliance led by the Athenians took the struggle in the opposite direction and landed some really severely heavy blows on the mighty Persian Empire without ever seriously threatening the Persian Empire's future existence, as of course Alexander was to do 150 odd years later. Now I select the Parthenon. You might think, how cliched. Well, that's precisely the point. Many people, not just us historians, speak of a golden age in the 5th century BC, centered on Athens, but not exclusive to Athens, or centered on Athens because that was centripetal. Athens was the capital of culture of all ancient Greece. The ancient Greek, if you like, Eastern ancient Greek world, not the West, not Sicily, South Italy, which had its own amazing centres. Peter Green wrote a book called The Shadow of the Parthenon. His point being that it casts a shadow over all subsequent Hellenic and therefore Western European history. Now we today, heirs to Black Lives Matter, to Me Too, are very, very conscious of all the defects of that Hellenic high cultural civilization of the 5th century by our modern standards. That building, where do you think the marble came from? Well, Penteli. It's quite a long way away. How did it get there? Who actually physically hewed the stone, hacked into it, put it onto carts, and transported it? And if I went up the Acropolis, or near to it, only a couple of weeks ago, I wasn't crazy enough, it was 33 degrees. It's extremely high. And so, just I'm making the point, slaves did both the casual, heavy, unskilled labour. And if we're to extrapolate from, famously, the Erechtheion later, they very likely some non-Greek, non-free citizen Greeks also carved some of the intricate mouldings and so on that adorn the exterior of the structure. So, as for the status of women, there is an irony. The chief religious official of the Athenian democratic state was a woman, because she was the hereditary, aristocratic, by birth, priestess of Athena of the city. And this is not the temple of Athena of the city, that is the later Erechtheion. This is the temple of one particular Athena, Athena Parthenos. And it's a very peculiar temple. It doesn't have its own dedicated altar. And what makes a temple in ancient Greece religious is the altar on which you sacrifice the relevant animal or liquid to the relevant deity. So, what is this? Well, you probably know this later on as the Athenian Empire developed and it shifted its money from the island of Delos, the treasury, to Athens. This was completed in 432. This becomes the Bank of England, or Fort Knox. So it's a very, very peculiar, special, unique sort of building, and it's sometimes identified as a peculiarly democratic symbol. Now, I'm not against that, because all the procedures of voting on shall we build it, when shall we build it, why wasn't it built until the 440s? Why did they wait? Well, some people think they didn't, but most of us think they did. Who was on the committee that decided to allocate how much funds, and who watched to see how the funds were spent? Well, they were all committees of the council and the assembly, and therefore of the democracy. It's entirely democratic. It's not, in other words, funded by Mellon or Getty, which is the standard mode of funding any major construction, as you well know today, as it always has been. A naming opportunity. No, this is the Athena Parthenos. It's not the Pericles Parthenon. And Pericles was intimately associated with the building, and that, of course, was very, very important. So, what goes with the Parthenon? This is but one symbol of what the Athenians collectively, and all those whose labour, whose skill they could commandeer, were capable of producing something absolutely extraordinary. But, just to add, what else was going on? Well, a great deal. Theatre, I've mentioned already a couple of times. The foundation of the idea, not just the practice, of our modern Western theatre. Rhetoric, and therefore high culture in a written, literary form. The highest visual art, sculpture, of course, mainly in bronze, which doesn't survive, it gets by and large melted down, but also, of course, in marble, of course, painted, very unlike our contemporary aesthetic. Science, especially medicine, these are all flourishing. The Hippocratic corpus develops from roughly the 460s, 450s BC, carries on through into the 4th century, of course. And, well, in a way, ça sans dire, but philosophy. This is the age of Socrates. Socrates was born in 470, 469, so 20 years before the Parthenon was begun. And he died by self-administered hemlock in 399, age 70, after the Peloponnesian War, partly in direct consequence of the Peloponnesian War, partly as revenge on people like him who Democrats thought had taken the wrong side in the Peloponnesian War or had supported the very vicious oligarchs we know as the 30 Tyrants. So for all those reasons, would any of those have happened but for the Battle of Plataea being the finally decisive battle in the Greco-Persian Wars of 499, if you like, to 479? I think the answer to that must be no. But counterfactual history is very popular in certain quarters. What if? Whole books are written about it. And of course it's always possible to argue that some form of Hellenic culture would have been tolerated by the Persians as it was tolerated between 545 or so and when the Greeks of Asia Minor rebelled in 499. But for that half century, there was some sort of Hellenic culture going on the western seaboard of Asia. However, the big change, and that's where I think democracy is relevant, one thing that the Persians would not have tolerated was a flourishing, independent democracy. It would have meant nothing to them, totally alien as a mode of discourse and decision-making. And it's an irony of historiography that if you read Herodotus, book 3, you will come to what's called the Persian debate, which is a thoroughly and entirely Greek debate. All the concepts are exclusively, they couldn't be anything but Greek, with some exception for perhaps autocracy, tyranny, monarchy. But the other stuff, the sort of oligarchy the Greeks had, the sort of democracy. And yet, Herodotus, well, could he have written, could he have existed, could he have conceived what he did, but for the conditions within which he grew up and was able to flourish. He was born in about 484, just before the main conflict that he was to describe 25, 30 years later. He's said to have, we have very little biographical information, he's said to have been involved in a local rising against a pro-Persian tyrant and therefore been exiled, and he therefore found his way to Athens. And it was, of course, Athens that was the making of him, though he spoke in a funny kind of hybrid dialect, which is not actually one that anybody really spoke. It's basically Homeric, and that's another reason he's called Homeric. It's Ionic rather than his own Doric, which was his native dialect, and it's not Attic, which is, of course, the Athenians' version of Ionic. So the Parthenon, democracy, Herodotus, if I was to be asked to say what three things do I not think would have been possible had the Persians won in 479, those would be them. But Greeks must be Greeks, and there was an ancient saying, you know, there's nothing as bad as an Attic neighbour, i.e. an Athenian, on your borders. But actually, most neighbours are pretty hostile to each other. And even relatively distant neighbours like the Athenians and Spartans. So yes, for that brief moment, Athens and Sparta united against the Persian invader. 479. Within 2 years, already, they were at loggerheads with each other. How best should we liberate those Greeks who are still in the Persian Empire? Who's to lead that campaign of liberation? So the Athenians got fed up and founded their own, quite separate, alliance with new oaths, which were to be permanent. In other words, as long as the Persian Empire existed, this alliance should persist. And it was that alliance, we call it first the Delian League, then the Athenian Empire. That was what Pericles advised and led, and in a way took into the next major confrontation, Greek, a kind of civil war, the so-called Atheno-Peloponnesian War. And I have selected just to illustrate one frieze block from the temple of Athena Nike. Now, what victory would Athena victory be referring to? You're right, over the Persians, way back when. In other words, a victory that the Spartans equally shared. But this is a very peculiarly Athenian temple. Where is it located? You want to go up on the Acropolis? You want to go through the Platea to the Parthenon? You go by the temple of Athena Nike. It hits you in the face. Well, I asked Anastasia to have this particular image for that very huge, if you think of the dimensions, and he's a Persian lying on his side. Well, those of you who remember your Herodotus book 9, one of the very early episodes in the Battle of Platea is where a huge Persian in glittering chain mail is felled. He's the sort of Goliath, and his name is Mazistios. Well, that, I think, is what the sculptor, the designer, and then the viewers imagined to be Mazistios. But he wasn't killed by an Athenian, and the battle, Platea, was a Spartan victory. Yes, there were lots of Athenians there, but the actual decisive fighting was done in the decisive battle by the Spartans. And so this is part of an ongoing culture war, which really hadn't ceased. I mean, it started pretty much in the 470s, and it goes way on through. And my next slide is of a particularly momentous moment in this culture war. In the 30s, a farmer at Menivi, his plough struck a very big stone. He thought it was a rock, but actually it was a finished stele. And it's in two parts. There's the relief, a hoplite shield with hoplite equipment, a breastplate, and sort of helmet on either side. So this is something to do with being a hoplite, a heavy-armed infantry fighter. Well, you learn more about him when you look at the very beautifully laid out stoichedon. Each row of letters is directly straight, crisscross, grid pattern. Two texts. One which is of its time, so it explains why it was set up this, when it was set up. In the 3 colonies, the Athenians had suffered a terrible defeat, together with the Thebans, against Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander. Battle of Cheronia Chaeronea in Boeotia. Boeotia, as Epaminondas called it, the orchestra, the dancing floor of Ares, the god of war. Lots of battles fought in Boeotia. So this first is dedication by the priest of Ares and the temple of Ares. There's only one of very, very few temples in Greece to the god of war. God of war was rather feared and despised and hated. He wasn't loved at Athena. And some of you may have seen a performance of Aristophanes' Acharnians. You'll remember. Why did he choose the Acharnians as the name of his chorus? Because they're the most bellicose. They're the most ones wanting to get their hands on the Spartans. And they have a temple of Ares, unlike every other deme. There were 139 villages or demes in Attica. And so it's an oath of the ephiboi, people who are on the threshold, epi, hibi, which means full adult age. So they're 18 to 20, and they sign up for 2 years military service, and they swear that they will be loyal, and then they list a whole load of gods, goddesses, of course, Ares, Athena, and so on, that they will honour, and they will patrol the boundaries. They'll be one. So they're on the cusp of becoming full Athenian citizen hoplite warriors. Hence the imagery at the top. Second text, oath of, we normally refer to as the oath of Platea. It purports to be, well, not just Athenians, but also Spartans, swore, well, when exactly? It is possible to find a moment. Spartans are coming up from Sparta. Athenians are moving northwest from Athens. They've got to meet somewhere before they move on to the battlefield of Platea. And one very symbolic place to meet, and it's very relevant to Platea as well, is Eleusis, sanctuary of Demeter. There's a lot of Demeter stuff in Herodotus in the Platea battle. And so it is not impossible that when the 8,000 Athenian hoplites met the 10,000 Lacedaemonian hoplites, 5,000 Spartans, 5,000 perioikoi, they swore another oath, in other words, on top of the oath that they'd all already sworn right before the Persians invaded. We swear to resist you, however, wherever. It's possible, but is it necessary? And then you look at all the details, and this was the point of my book, after Thermopylae. And on balance, my view is that it's probably a fake. And it's part of the culture war. And what it's saying is, we Athenians sacrificed as much as you Spartans at Platea. We contributed just as much at Platea as you Spartans. And why in 335? Well, I've mentioned Chaeronea. That applies particularly to the Athenians, because Spartans didn't resist Macedon. So they didn't get defeated by Macedon. They didn't get invaded by Macedon. So they weren't really of any significance whatsoever in the 330s. Why, therefore, would you want to put this in a stele which probably the original will be circulated more widely? Certainly the oath is generic. It's not just a Carnian, it's not local. But the other one, what's the point of it? Well, the leading Athenian politician of the second half of the 330s was a man called Lycurgus. Really, same name as the most famous Spartan. Probably a myth, the Lycurgus of Sparta, but anyway, the same name. And he knew a lot about Sparta, and he actually quotes a Spartan poet, though he rather wickedly says, no, he wasn't really Spartan, he was actually an Athenian lame whom the Spartans hired. Again, culture wars. But Lycurgus would be a major figure behind what's been looked at as a kind of internal reform. If you've suffered a major defeat, imagine Germany in 1945, you've got to do something really to reconfigure yourself, to pull yourself together, to give yourself ideals. And that, I think, is the context in which the Oath of Platea should be slotted. And I'm going to end with taking you right back to where I started, with the serpent column, the commemorative bronze, 3 coils, 3 heads at the top, one of which has survived rather good, I think. It's dug up in the earth below. It fell off. I mean, the thing was complete, 200 or 300 years ago, as recently as that. You know, it's not been destroyed hundreds of years ago. But why is it in Constantinople? Because Constantine, he's going to found a new Rome. He takes Byzantion as his new capital. He renames it immodestly after himself. Well, Alexander had lots of cities named after him, so just one was really being very modest. And Constantinople is its home. It's actually in the Hippodrome area of the Constantinople, Istanbul. Originally Delphi, and so I've got 2 questions which I'll try to answer briefly. Why did the Spartans set up their victory monument? For, in particular, it's after Platea, but it's, the heading says, these fought the war, and the war must mean all the battles. Why in Delphi and not elsewhere? Were there alternatives possible? And then secondly, why snakes? And in a way the answers go together. Delphi was one of the 4 major Panhellenic shrines of ancient Greece, where games took place on a regular circuit. It was number 2 in priority to Olympia. So the question really is not so much why Delphi, but why not Olympia? Zeus, after all, was the principal god of all the Greeks, because the Olympic site and festival was managed by the city of Elis. Elis was an ally of Sparta within its own organisation, but Herodotus says, very suspiciously, they turned up late for the Battle of Platea. Now, there's no excuse for that, because you know the army would muster in the Peloponnese, in the Nemea region. So Olympia, you come over from the far west, Elis, you come. No excuse for them to be late. But that's because we know in the next decade Sparta's fighting against Elis, Mantinea, other allies who are not happy with the way the Spartans were conducting themselves. We are told by Herodotus that there was a commemorative statue, a very large bronze, at another of the Panhellenic sites, and that is Isthmia, which is in honour of Poseidon near Corinth, and that was where the oaths originally were sworn. All those very few Greeks who were going to fight the Persians, resist, they swore the oath in the sanctuary of Apollo at the Isthmus. So that explains, I think, why Delphi in a geopolitical sense. Secondly, Sparta and Delphi, the Delphic oracle, had a, if you like, special relationship. 2 officials by each of the kings, so 4 altogether, were permanent ambassadors, sacred ambassadors, to the shrine of Delphi and the Apollo-Delphi oracle. So if Sparta had a major problem, internal, external, and they wanted sanction from above, they would send to Delphi. Nothing unusual. I mean, Sparta's not unique, but it was very particularly a way Spartans did things. How had Apollo come to be in control of Delphi? By slaying an enormous snake, Python. And so another name for Delphi was Putho. It's the name of the site. So there's a very snaky feel to Delphi and Apollo, and that would be suitable. But finally, I think the clincher is this. Snake sheds its skin. It was therefore seen as a symbol of rebirth. Entirely appropriate, therefore, when you're celebrating dead heroes who you hope will have a happy afterlife, obviously down below in ancient Greek thoughts, not up above. You therefore want to do all you can in your funeral ritual to ease their passage from above to below. If you go to the Sparta Museum, as Leonidas recently did, you'll see lots and lots of stelae, that is slabs with figured decoration, of a hero, often with his hand like this under his chin, sitting on a stool or something like that. He's the dead man, and behind him rears up a snake above his head, very friendly, you know, looking after him. One incorporation with Zeus Meilichios was depicted, the gentle, the calming Zeus was depicted as a snake. So snakes are very positive. And that is where, if you've had the patience to bear with me and been listening, thank you very much for listening.